Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. Our story takes place today in Sugar Land, Texas, which is a suburb right outside of Houston. Being from Houston, this is an area that I know well. Kent Whitaker and his wife Patricia, who also went by Trish, were raising their two sons. Thomas, who went by his middle name Bart, which was short for Bartlett, and Kevin, who just went by Kevin. Bart was a college student at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas, and Kevin was 19 and currently attended Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas, after he had attended Houston Community College. Sugar Land, for the most part, is a very safe part of town, so you can imagine why a lot of people choose to raise their families there. Kent Whitaker managed and was the comptroller of a construction business, and Trish was an elementary school teacher. Kent did very well in his construction business because at the time a lot of people were building or upgrading their homes, and when they weren't, they still did okay because of how well the business did during peak times. On the night of December 10th, 2003, the Whitaker family was celebrating their son Bart, who was about to graduate from Sam Houston State University with a degree in criminal justice. The family was in nearby Stafford, Texas, eating at a Pappadeaux restaurant, which is the seafood division of the Papa's restaurant universe. Love the Papas. And they were there to celebrate his upcoming graduation. They had a great night out celebrating. They ended up gifting Bart a Rolex. They were so proud of him, and they were just enjoying their time out together as a family. Because Bart and Kevin both went to different colleges in different cities away from Sugar Land, they weren't often all together as a family, so being together this night was very special, and they were really enjoying their time together. But when they returned to their home in the Sugar Lakes subdivision, they were ambushed by two masked men. Kevin was the first to enter the home, followed by his father Kent and mother Trish. Bart kind of hung behind in the driveway because he was checking the messages on his phone. Several gunshots were fired, which alarmed neighbors, and they called 911 to report this. Bart ended up getting shot in the shoulder, but he was able to call 911 shortly after. While on the phone with the 911 operator, Bart said that he had chased one of the masked men through the living room and the kitchen and then out the back door. Initially, police thought that they had misheard the 911 dispatch because a quadruple shooting just doesn't happen in Sugar Land. When the police and ambulance finally arrived, it was unfortunately too late for Trish and her youngest son Kevin, who tragically were killed by gunshot wounds to the chest. Because the severity of Bart's wounds were a shot to the shoulder, and the fact that he was able to dial 911, meant that he would likely survive. His father Kent was also shot in the upper arm, and luckily was able to be transported to the hospital to treat his wounds, and he did survive. When the police were surveying the scene, they actually found the gun that was used in the attack, which was a 9mm pistol, just lying on the kitchen floor. Just lying there. They also found and collected several spent shell casings. A single glove was found in the driveway of the home, and police collected it for testing. When the responding detective, Marshall Slott, was led to the glove, he thought, "Oh no, not another OJ." It had appeared that the family were intended targets of a robbery, since the house was a mess and all the drawers in the house were pulled out. But nothing was missing. I don't know how they were able to determine this. You don't know what stuff I have, but they had determined that nothing was missing. While taking a closer look throughout the house, it was as if someone just slightly pulled open every drawer in the house, but the gap was too small to rifle through or pull anything out. Suspicious. Just a few hours after the attack on the Whitaker family, police got notice of another attack that occurred just a few miles away where a masked man entered the home, roughed up the people inside, and then tied them up. When he fled, a chase ensued, and police were able to corner him in the parking lot of an apartment complex. When they had approached his car, he actually ended up killing himself. They were later able to identify the man as Lathan Jackson. Lathan Jackson was 22 years old at the time and had just recently been released from prison 3 months earlier for drug possession. Police thought that he might have been involved in the attack on the Whitaker family and called in the sniffer dogs to further investigate. Detective Keith Pickett from the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Department arrived with his nationally recognized scent discriminating bloodhounds. Their names were Quincy, Colombo, and James Bone, and they sound like very good boys. They gave the glove found at the scene to the bloodhounds, hoping that they would be able to pick up a scent. Unfortunately, the dogs did not pick up the same scent on Lathan's clothing as they did on the glove, so the search continued. When police were going through the house and established that nothing was missing, the only thing unaccounted for was Bart's cell phone. So, was this what the masked men had intended to steal? Maybe. There were some things that just didn't add up, and it was bothering investigators. Somehow it seemed that the masked killers knew that the family were gone and that they were together, and knew just when they would return home. Something specific that police had noted at the scene was that 4 shots were fired and all 4 family members were hit. They know that 4 shots were fired because they collected 4 spent shell casings at the scene. This was a high level of accuracy, and it was noted that some police don't even have this hit ratio. This made it appear that this was done by a professional. Something that was crazy to me and just super suspect is that when the serial number of the gun that was used on the attack was run by police, they discovered that it was registered to Kevin Whitaker. He always kept it in a lockbox in his bedroom, but not just out in the open. It was kept in a built-out crawl space that wasn't immediately obvious, so someone would have had to have known that it was there. Police had discovered that the lockbox appeared to have been broken into with what looked like a crowbar. On the outside of the lockbox, there were small paint fragments and markings indicated that it was done with a crowbar or a pry bar of some kind. One would think that while committing a robbery, you would come with all of your things. You wouldn't assume to go up into a bedroom, happen upon a box, pry open a box, and find a gun inside that you then use for your attack. Now investigators are starting to think, okay, the masked men had to have known the family, and it is possible that they were even close with them, since they knew enough to know that there was a safe upstairs in Kevin's bedroom with a gun in it that had a combination and would need a crowbar or some other type of tool to pry it open. If you recall a minute ago, I mentioned that Bart had said he had chased one of the masked men through the kitchen and out the back door. This makes me think that they had been in the house before, or at least knew that is where they would escape from. While reporting on the crime, Eric Hansen, a writer for the Houston Chronicle newspaper, probably the biggest and most well-known Houston newspaper. I mean, I live there and I can't think of too many other newspapers. Eric Hansen had called Sam Houston State University to ask what degree Bart Whitaker would be graduating with, and he got some shocking news. The administrator on the phone told Eric that Bart was not a student there, and he would not be graduating. Bart continued to take tuition money from his parents and spent it partying with his friends. His parents had assumed that because he was still taking tuition money from them, and because he still lived in Huntsville, that he was attending school and even graduating soon. And as far as they knew, he was an exemplary student, even telling them that he was graduating magna cum laude. His father Kent later went on to say that we never asked him to show us any grades, but that Bart had showed them a transcript at one point, but thinking back, could have been faked. Okay, wow, so there you go. Kent, although very disappointed at this point, to say the very least, had a hard time believing that this whole situation had anything to do with the murder of his wife Trish and his youngest son Kevin, as well as the attempt on his life. A former friend of Bart's, named Adam Hipp, had gone to police and told them that 2 years earlier, Bart had come to him and tried to hire him to kill his whole family. He said that Bart was financially motivated and was intending on inheriting his parents' multi-million-dollar estate. Adam was able to corroborate his story by providing details of the plan, as well as the layout of the home and knowledge about where the firearm was stored. He said things that only someone involved would know. He even drew police a map where he detailed where Bart would have instructed him to stand in order to shoot Kent, Trish, and Kevin. Adam actually had an airtight alibi for the night of the shooting. He was in Dallas, which is about 4 hours away from Sugar Land, working at a bank with multiple witnesses. Also, somehow, some way, Kent and Trish had found out about Bart's plan 2 years earlier, but they didn't believe it, and when they contacted the other person involved in the plot, they were somehow able to convince them that it was actually just a joke. When Kent asked Bart about it, he denied it, and he convinced him that he had nothing to worry about, and Kent believed him. So much so that when police told Kent that Bart was involved, he couldn't believe it and almost didn't want to. After all of this had come out and Bart was exposed as a fraud, and after he was released from the hospital, he had gotten a graduation card from a family friend that had a $50 check in it, and he cashed it. You set this whole thing up and tried to take out your entire family, and you're cashing a check for $50 for a graduation you are not participating in from a school you do not attend. Because the police had information from Adam that Bart had tried to recruit him to commit his previous crime, they were pretty sure that he had had help this time. The only question was who. They looked at who was in his inner circle at the time and came across his roommate, Chris Brashear, and their neighbor from down the hall, Stephen Champagne. When police questioned Chris and Stephen, they both denied any knowledge or involvement. They did agree to provide DNA and scent samples, so if they truly had no involvement, police would be able to eliminate them as suspects right away. In order to get the scent sample, police had them rinse their hands with distilled water and then dry them off with a paper towel that was then sealed in a baggie. The baggies were then given to the sniffer dogs in what was called a scent lineup to compare with things like the glove and the handgun that were found at the scene. Out of 3 tests, the dogs had picked up scents that matched with Chris. I am amazed with these dogs, wow, what great police work. Unfortunately, this evidence was not admissible in court. I don't know why the dog would lie, but it's okay because police were still on their trail. Police put wiretaps on their phones, but this didn't end up turning up anything. Police continued speaking with Chris and Stephen's friends, trying to squeeze out any information they might have. Over a year and a half passed, and I guess the pressure was getting to them because Stephen confessed to police that Bart had asked him and Chris to kill Bart's family. Stephen had said that he was only the driver, and it was Chris who pulled the trigger. He had told police that after the murders, they had thrown a bag of evidence into Lake Conroe, which ran alongside a bridge that they went over during their getaway. Remember, a year and a half had passed at this point, but police still sent people to scour the lake, and sure enough, they found a bag at the bottom of the lake. Inside the bag were unused 9mm bullets that had matched the gun used, a crowbar, presumably used to pry open Kevin's safe where the gun was kept, a plastic water bottle, and Bart Whitaker's cell phone that police were never able to recover from the scene. They were able to use infrared light to test the paint chips that were scraped off from the crowbar and found that they had matched the paint fragments found on Kevin's safe. They also tested the water bottle, and despite being underwater for a year and a half, they amazingly were able to establish a genetic profile. Because the bottle's cap was sealed on, it sealed the DNA into the plastic threads of the cap. And guess whose DNA it matched? Chris Brashear's DNA matched the water bottle from the sample he had provided 18 months earlier. Several months later, and almost 2 years after the murders, Stephen Champagne and Chris Brashear were arrested and charged with capital murder. Something to note, neither of them were ever paid for their part in the crime. I don't know if payment was promised or they had agreed on something, but no payment was made. Police were still looking for Bart Whitaker, who they had found out had escaped to Mexico, but was caught very soon after. When Bart was sitting in the back of the police car after being caught, he was asked, How do you do this? And Bart said, "It's easy. You just offer people what they want." Ugh. It was later found out that Bart was not the most exemplary student. Obviously. As a student at Clements High School, he was criminally convicted of 7 burglaries that he had meticulously planned and had gotten several of his friends involved in the burglaries. At the trial, prosecutors believe that the attack on the family was extensively planned out from the very beginning. He had told his parents that he had passed all of his final exams and that he was getting ready to graduate. He came home to Sugar Land from Huntsville to celebrate, and when they were out to dinner, his plan was already in motion. Bart had previously given Chris the key to his family's home, where he was able to use a crowbar to break into Kevin's safe and retrieve the gun. He then went on to stage the scene by opening up all the drawers in the house to give the illusion of a robbery to throw police off his scent. But remember, he had barely opened them and nobody had thought a robbery had taken place. Get real, Chris. Meanwhile, Stephen was acting as the lookout at the restaurant. He then called Chris when the Whitaker family was leaving to go home. When they returned home, Chris ambushed them. Remember, Bart had hung back in the driveway to check his messages on his phone while his family proceeded to go inside the house, where Chris fatally shot Trish and Kevin in the chest and hitting Kent in his shoulder, but thankfully he survived. It is believed that Bart was shot in the shoulder as well, as planned. They believe that Chris had dropped the gun at the scene by accident and ended up picking up Bart's cell phone by mistake as he was running out the back door to join Stephen, who was waiting outside in the car 2 blocks away with the engine running. It is unknown why Stephen put the water bottle he was drinking out of into the bag with the crowbar, the bullets, and Bart's phone to then throw into Lake Conroe. This literally ties you to the crime. Stephen Champagne was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison because of his testimony leading to the arrest and conviction of Bart Whitaker and Chris Brashear. Chris Brashear was ultimately convicted of 2 counts of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Bart was refused a plea bargain by the DA, and in return for admission of his guilt, was tried for capital murder. The evidence that was presented showed that Bart had recruited his two friends with the intention of Chris being the shooter and Steve being the getaway driver. While on the stand, Steven had described Bart recruiting him to be the getaway driver and said they had planned to shoot Bart superficially in the shoulder, which was a ploy to make it look like he was a victim too. Prosecutors had agreed that even though Bart did not pull the trigger, he was responsible for the murders because he played the leading part in the conspiracy to commit the murders. They had said that the main motive was money, and that he was intending on removing any competition for his inheritance, as well as the insurance payout that he was expecting to receive, which totaled around $1.5 million. It was noted at the time of the trial that Bart had access to a trust fund from his parents worth $80,000. Bart had testified that he did not know he could access the trust fund. He also said that he was not motivated by money because the insurance policy out on his father was only worth $50,000. His father, Kent, says that he forgives his son, Chris and Steven, for their part in the murders, and at the time of Bart's trial, tried to persuade the jury to not deliver a death sentence. Bart Whitaker was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He had spent several years on death row in a prison in Livingston, Texas, and was scheduled to be executed at 6 p.m. on February 22, 2018, but about 40 minutes before his scheduled execution time, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, had commuted his sentence to life in prison without parole. This was the first time that Greg Abbott had commuted such a sentence, as well as the first sentence commutation since 2007. His sentence was commuted to life in prison due to a heavy effort by his father Kent, who met with the Board of Pardons asking that they spare my son. He also met with the chairman of the board for over half an hour and was able to convince them of the sentence commutation. He is currently living in Beeville, Texas in a state prison where he will hopefully and most likely never leave. This was just such a sad story, and like all murders, did not have to happen. If anyone approaches you and asks if you would like any part in a crime, say no. Call police. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.
The soul has lost internet connection.
Okay.